Hello, Andy Strong here. Welcome to the Fundamentally Fit podcast. And this is just me doing a quick intro before we jump into today's podcast fully. When I sat down to record this podcast, the intention was to split it into two. I was intending on talking about the Game Changers documentary over on Netflix. And then in the second half, I was going to be breaking down a review of the use of plant-based diets in endurance sports, being a big runner and endurance advocate myself. However, once I had recorded the first part of the podcast, we were sitting at just over the 30-minute mark, and conscious of your time and the fact that you may not have an hour to sit down and listen to a podcast, I decided that I would call it there and we would just focus on that aspect of the podcast for today. I will be recording another part in the future where I will break down that review of plant-based diets and their use in endurance sports, but as I reference it today in the podcast, please note that it won't be in there and that I will be doing that in the future, and this podcast is going to round it out at just around 32 to 33 minutes. Thanks for your time. I hope you enjoy this third part of the series. Please share it with someone who you think will benefit from it, and let's jump into today's podcast and let's do the intro proper. Hello and welcome back to the Fundamentally Fit podcast with me, your host, Andy Strong, and a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, as it is right now, to wherever it is that you are tuning in to this week's podcast. And this week's podcast is episode number 3. It is our final episode of our three-part series, put my teeth in, where we've been talking about plant-based diets. We've been looking at some of the different components that make up plant-based diets, as it is now drawing to a close as I record this, Veganuary. So, back in episode number 1, we were talking about adopting plant-based diets and some of the reasons people would be interested in considering moving to a more plant-heavy or plant-driven diet. Some of the ethical reasons. We looked a little bit at some of the environmental factors behind it. And then beyond that, I wanted to draw on my experience and my time in the industry working with people from all different kinds of backgrounds, all different kinds of motivations, trying to make really big, meaningful, long-term, larger scale lifestyle change. Being a diabetes and obesity specialist, I'm very familiar with helping people make pretty big changes to their lifestyle, and I know that type of change, for whatever motivation, health being a really, really big one, but also, the many plant-based people out there for ethical and for environmental reasons as well, that type of change requires a lot of things to happen. And there are a lot of barriers to success that people have to overcome. And in the first episode, we kind of break those down and look at some of the things I feel people not only need to overcome, but also for this particular type of diet to become mainstream in a very big way, are going to have to overcome with the masses, rather than perhaps just the earlier adopters and those that are now starting to explore it in months like we are in right now, Veganuary. So go check out episode number 1 if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that. Back in episode number 2, I was talking about what does it really mean to be plant-based in 2020? Because many people will think of plant-based and they'll think veganism, and for a lot of people, they won't. Now, while plant-based and veganism are actually interchangeable expressions for the same thing, there are actually a lot of variations on plant-based styled diets. And so we broke down what all of those different types of diets were, some of the different approaches that might be more flexible or might fit your lifestyle a little bit better than maybe a more strict vegan diet, or you could even use them as a stepping stone if that was appropriate for what you wanted to achieve. But we looked at some of those different options out there to give you a better understanding of what plant-based really means in 2020. We rounded that podcast out looking at some of the health factors and some of the nutritional components that you might want to be careful of, or that you might want to make sure that you're getting right, just to make sure your long-term health isn't suffering. And again, this is not the most comprehensive overview of plant-based diets in the world. This series is designed for people that are newer to the world of plant-based diets. It's people that are looking to maybe adapt their diet for whatever reason, to include more plant-based foods, which is a cool thing to do regardless of your background. but it's to try and give you a better understanding of some of the factors behind it. Maybe not such a useful podcast for people who've been vegan and vegetarian for a long, long time. But if you do know someone that is newer to plant-based diets or is considering it, please do share this podcast with them, because I think there'll be a lot of information in here that they'll find really, really valuable. And of course, if they need any additional support or help, you can always reach out, get in touch, Andy at fundamentallyfit.co.uk, and I'd be happy to have a chat and see if we can't help you structure out your diet in a way that's really, really helpful for the future. That being said, we're on episode number 3. So I think I've enjoyed this series. I think it's been really good. I've enjoyed recording it. I've enjoyed researching it. And I want to round it out really strongly. And the way that I'm going to do that is we're going to talk about the Game Changers documentary. I'm not going to get angry. And we're going to round this podcast out talking about plant-powered endurance. So are there any additional benefits or notable benefits to following a plant-based diet and endurance sports? And there's 2 motivations behind this particular podcast. Part 1, Game Changers documentary, which we'll go into a reasonable amount of detail in a moment. I want to look at some of the critical thinking skills behind any type of diet, but particularly around plant-based diets that have a lot of hype and a lot of noise often that is not always the most helpful, and the Game Changers is a really useful way to explore some of that. Plant-powered endurance, I'm going to be perfectly honest, I like to run and do triathlons, so I thought, I wonder what plant-based research there is out there, and I've got a nice review. We're going to go through some of the things that it says in this review of these different studies and see what conclusions we can kind of start to draw upon, and some of the things we can think about when we're looking to fuel our running, our cycling, swimming, whatever it may be. And that's purely a selfish one because I like to go running, and I hope you find that useful. But certainly the Game Changers, I think this is a really, really important topic that we go through first off. Now, that being said, thank you for tuning in. We're going to jump into the podcast now. But if you have enjoyed this series, please give us a review, give us a thumbs up, give us a like, send us a little bit of love in the social space, share this podcast with somebody who you think would find it really useful, and that would be a really, really helpful thing to do. Now, if you're not familiar with the Game Changers documentary over on Netflix, it is the latest in a series of documentaries that's been coming out over the last few years. They are plant-based or vegan-driven. It has an air of propaganda to it, because it is quite biased in its approach, or the series of different documentaries that's been out over the past few years is very, very biased. And these documentaries include What the Health, which caused a lot of controversy, Knives Over Forks, and Cowspiracy as well. We're talking about Game Changers today, which focuses more on the sporting performance and fitness based benefits of vegan and plant-based diets. But the big challenge with all of these types of documentaries is that many, many people now get their nutritional advice through these different types of media, and Netflix styled documentaries is a big one. And unfortunately, the way a lot of this information is presented is not impartial. It is heavily biased. The scientists and the people that they're referencing have big motivations. They have companies that are aligned to these types of diets, and therefore you're not getting the most balanced approach. And often lots of the ways that they present their studies are not suitable for presenting information in a way that is implied to be as scientifically sound and conclusive as often it is presented on the screen. One of the other classic kind of tropes of these types of documentary is that they will flash a study up on the screen, and it will have a section that's highlighted, and they flash it up for 5 seconds, and then another one pops up on the screen. So they're trying to pull in the scientific data that's there, but it really doesn't tell you anything because you can't stop and read it. You don't really know what study it's referencing. You don't really know if this is peer reviewed, so if it's actually something that has got some sound credibility. You don't really know what type of study it was. But if you are watching the documentary, and completely forgiven for this if this sounds like yourself, and I would completely fall into this category if I didn't have the nutritional background that I do. If I was just reading magazines, watching these types of documentaries, I would think that it was 100% accurate, or certainly I would think it was more accurate than I do based on the knowledge that I have. And you can be forgiven for that. And while we're going to look at this documentary today, we're going to look at a few things just to kind of to look at a few specifics of what I think are quite important out of this documentary. We're not going to go into the real minutiae of the nutritional information found within it. We absolutely could do that, but this particular documentary, like What the Health, which came before it, there are an absolute abundance of people out there that have done breakdowns, podcasts, videos, blogs, and you can go and find that information, and it is openly out there for you to go and do that. If you would like a more detailed breakdown of the nutritional side of this outside of what I'm going to be talking about today, I reckon that you go and check out Ben Coomber's podcast. Him and Tom Bainbridge go into lots of details of some of the main aspects of this documentary that were people talked about, and actually break down what is accurate and what is perhaps more misleading or less substantive than what is presented. Now, I will add a caveat to that to be transparent. I am understandably and unquestionably biased in that recommendation, because I did my nutrition coaching, or some of my nutrition coaching I did through the BTN Academy. I trained under Ben and under Tom. I really like what they do. I've presented at their conference several times. I sometimes do work for BTN on occasion, so I have my alliances to them and my allegiances to them. I think they do things in a really evidence-based way, a really practical way, and a really understandable way. I would recommend them to anyone, and I do recommend them to lots of people that I work with, but just to put that out there so that people can't say that afterwards, oh yeah, but he does work for them and he does this and he does that. That's just me being transparent. That being said, Game Changers itself, as I mentioned already, it is motivated by the fitness component of plant-powered or plant-based diets. And the documentary is presented, or kind of, we follow the journey and the story of the presenter, which is quite a likeable chap. His name is James Wilkes. He's a combat specialist, and he is a retired UFC fighter, an MMA fighter. And we kind of follow his journey as he goes through the documentary, and it's kind of intertwined with some of the studies and different things that they do, and then occasionally it cuts to a different athlete. Maybe it's an Olympian, maybe it's Arnold Schwarzenegger, maybe it's a boxer, or it's a UFC fighter. There's a lot of big names in this documentary, so that adds a lot of weight to what is being said. What we have to remember, though, is that while a lot of the athletes that present in this documentary are world class, and that is undeniable, we have to consider that they are the athlete at the end of the process, and respectfully, there are teams of people behind these athletes that support them and help get them to where they need to be. Now, that's not to say they don't have any nutritional knowledge at all, because that would be ridiculous, but we have to consider the fact that they are carefully looked after, and the situations and the ways they train is carefully managed by professionals of the highest standard. And so to just use an athlete in this way and say they've gone plant-based and therefore they're doing really well is not really useful enough for the average individual who may be going to the gym 2, 3, 4 times per week and looking to run their 10k a little bit faster. We have to take that important context when we're looking at documentaries like this. Now, we follow James's journey as he goes through this, and actually there's some background to this. Is that he kicks off the documentary and he has had an injury. And when he had this injury, he got heavily into his nutritional knowledge and education, and started learning a lot more about what he needed to be eating to promote his recovery, to help enhance his performance. And then as we go through the documentary, he decides that he's going to take up a vegan diet, and he's going to give it a go. And we see a scene where he goes to, I believe it's a drive-through, and he makes this statement that he can only think of one meat-free meal, and that meat-free meal is a burrito, which he orders. And then we go, I believe the next scene then goes to their next study, which is a section with burritos and 3 different athletes, and it's quite a memorable scene from the documentary. Now, that's fine, but what I really want to demonstrate here is that you don't have to necessarily have an absolute grasp on everything in the world of nutrition, because I'll be perfectly honest, nobody does. It is vastly complex and it's changing all the time. And you don't need to have the most soundest, solidest grasp on every component of nutrition to understand when something is being misleading. And we have to consider this, because often it is not how deep does your nutritional knowledge go, but how effectively can you engage your critical thinking skills. And really, nutrition coaching, working with clients, most people, not all, but most people do realistically understand what they should be eating, and they do understand what would be a better balance for them. What we have to do is help them with their critical thinking skills, help them to stop making the mistakes, bring in some structure, and give them some ways to be successful in the long term. If you apply the same critical thinking skills to a documentary like this, you can start to look below, even scratching just a little bit below the surface, and actually it doesn't hold up in the way that it's put forward. And then that enables you to think a little bit more critically about what you're being presented with, and actually asking yourself, does this seem too good to be true? And often the answer to that is, well, yes, actually it probably is. And this brings us back to James and his statement that he could only think of one meat-free meal to eat if he was going to take up this vegan diet. And this statement, in my opinion, is misleading, because if you scratch below the surface, you'll actually find that James started going meat-free and dairy-free back in 2011. And so following on from an injury in March 2011, James was forced to train less, so had more time to study nutrition, and at this stage he cut out meat and dairy. This statement comes from greatveganathletes.com, who basically have a profile on James, and they also said at the time James has not hit the mark for being fully vegan, and they've not given him a permanent profile on the site, and this is because his neighbour had rescued bees, and James eats the honey from the hive, so therefore technically is not vegan. However, if he makes the steps going full vegan, they're happy to give him a profile on the page. Different thread there. But what we have to consider is that this documentary came out tail end of 2019. According to greatveganathletes.com, who've done this profile on James, he started cutting out meat and dairy back in 2011. Now, I don't know how long it takes to record a documentary like this. I'm pretty sure that it doesn't take from 2011 to 2019 to get the whole thing shot and released, because back in 2011 there was not this level of push towards vegan and plant-based diets at all. And if we look at the numbers from last week based on the UK, I am fairly certain that that's not the case. So this means that James presents himself as having decided to go vegan as part of the documentary process. Now, he could well have decided to go fully vegan for the documentary. That may well be true. However, he was already experimenting and cutting out meat and dairy back in 2011, so therefore he knows more than one meat-free meal. You could argue I'm being a bit pedantic, but the point is he's presenting as being something that he's not, which then when you later go through the documentary and he has a scene where he's in the gym and he's on the battle ropes, and they have a thing in the gym where I believe it's if you do more than 20 minutes, you get your name on the board of the gym for 20 minutes of solid battle rope work. He does this, goes through the 20 minutes, is feeling great, carries on, does an hour, decides to stop because he's bored effectively, and becomes the highest ranking on the board ever, and puts it all down to his new diet and performance being so amazing. Now, I don't know if that was filmed around 2011, 2012, and it's a difficult thing to try and find out. I just struggle to believe that that's the case. And that is the thread that runs through this documentary in essence. There are different studies that are presented to be more factual than they are. They're not, it's areas of science that are not conclusive and not proven to be conclusive, and that it's not described in that way. The big one there is the different burritos that are given to the three different footballers, professional American footballers, and they're measuring rates of erection overnight. And so again, they're making these claims, and coming back to this particular part of the documentary, which for a lot of people was most memorable because it was amusing for a lot of people. You've got these three professional American footballers. They're assessing how meat impacts, or how animal-based products, meat, impacts on your erectile function. And it's all really amusing. They all can't stop laughing. They're getting their results. They're all giggling. They're all looking at each other. And lo and behold, the vegan has the longest or most substantial, sustained erection. And it's all very, very amusing. So they're implied that if you eat meat, then your ability to get an erection is going to be reduced. That is far from being conclusive science, and the way the study was done, there's a number of issues within that. However, again, they actually go into a lot of detail around this on the Ben Coomer podcast, so go check that out if you're interested in learning about the science behind that. Again, critical thinking here is important, because for me, this scene was actually not about the amusing science and, making it playful. This scene was about something else, in my opinion, looking at this from a critical point of view. This scene was doing a classic trope of the health and fitness space. It was selling with fear. It was using fear to make a vegan and plant-based diet look more appealing than it may have otherwise done to a very specific target market. In this case, big, burly American men who are overly manly and would feel probably more likely to try this type of diet if you're telling them that they're going to have a problem in the bedroom with erections. It is purely motivated by fear, in arguably the same way as a lot of people are targeted in the health and fitness industry for being beach body ready and being able to wear a bikini on holiday. It's fear of being embarrassed, having to be covered up, all of those different things. And they honed in on the one thing I would argue that men would fear losing the most for obvious reasons, and they made that a key part of their documentary, because they knew, regardless of the fact that the science is not conclusive in any way, shape or form, enough people would see that, and enough men would see that from a background that perhaps would not consider it otherwise, would maybe think twice about a vegan or a plant-based diet. Now, you can of course have an argument that if that's the case, and some people start eating less meat and more vegetables, more plant-based, that's a good thing. But you need to do it in a way that people choose to do it. You can't scare them into doing it. And that, to me, is what that scene was all about. And that sums up a lot of what this documentary was. Now, if we just go through some of the things relatively quickly, because I want to move on to the second half of this documentary and actually look at one of the bigger studies of plant-based diets on endurance performance. We had a big range of athletes that were represented within this documentary, and some fairly big names as well. So we had McGregor and Nate Diaz in the world of UFC. We had a lot of pro-American footballers. We had Morgan Mitchell, who's an Australian 400-meter champion. We had Arnold Schwarzenegger, who is, well, he's just God, isn't he? And then, of course, we had a few other people as well. Around the outside, we had a boxer, we had a strongman, and again, it made for a really diverse mix of backgrounds, sporting backgrounds, which again made it very watchable. And to be perfectly honest, it was very watchable. And now, the problem with this is that a lot of what was said around these athletes and their performances and how they felt since switching to a plant-based diet and a vegan-based diet is not enough to basically substantially say that these diets are scientifically better. And they also make quite a lot of generalizations and things that you just are taken out of context. So in terms of McGregor and Nate Diaz, UFC fighters, McGregor actually lost this fight. People weren't expecting him to lose it. And he mentions that being 9 days out from the fight, he was eating 2 steaks a day. And by comparison, Nate Diaz, a vegan athlete, obviously had beaten him. It was a big shock in the UFC world. And then McGregor then starts looking at his diet, and he doesn't switch to a vegan diet or anything like that. But he's like, you know what? I wasn't eating great. I was eating all these steaks. And this is actually a thread that runs through quite a lot more of the documentary. We can't necessarily say that because Nate Diaz was vegan, that is why he performed so much better than Conor McGregor. But in reality, was the diet that Conor McGregor was actually following at the time appropriate? And that's a completely different argument. We don't know what the rest of his diet looked like. And actually, could he optimize his nutrition? Probably yes. I'm not the right person for that job for sure. It's a different level of performance, but you can start to look at it and say, well, actually, is the balance of this diet correct, and do we need to go to the extreme of cutting out all of these different food groups and all animal products? The two don't necessarily go together, that one wasn't very good, so therefore you must switch to the more extreme alternative. And again, what we talked about in episode number 2 was looking at these different types of plant-based diets and how some might be better suited to people than others, or actually just finding a better balanced diet that includes these animal sources. Now, again, we see this play out in a couple of other ways. We have a team of pro footballers. They're eating their dinner. They've got these enormous dinner plate size steaks. They're the biggest steaks I think I've ever seen. And then they talk about how actually, they wouldn't really eat an awful lot of veg. It's very meat driven, very meat motivated. Arguably, again, a better balanced diet would be a good thing. Eating some veg and reducing the size of those steaks, for sure. Yes, they need a lot more calories because of the type of sport and exercise that they're doing, but is the balance of their diet actually better? And do they feel so much better on their vegan diet that they switch to purely because actually the diet wasn't really working for them in the first place? But does that mean that the vegan diet is better? You can't necessarily draw those two conclusions from what's presented. Then we have some other just generally misleading things. So Morgan Mitchell, who's the Australian 400 metre champion, she talks about some of the things that she was worried about switching to a plant-based diet, such as B12 and iron, and different things different areas becoming deficient. Some of the main things we talked about in the last podcast, some of the things you do need to be careful on these vegan diets. And she said she had a team of dietitians to help her. And she thought she was going to have to do lots of supplementation. And she said everything she thought she was going to be deficient with was just amazing. And that was the description. It was, she was worried about becoming deficient, but it's been amazing. And I don't really know what you're supposed to draw from that. She's saying that you don't need to supplement because you fundamentally do. That's just a fact. And if we take B12 as the kind of main one, they also claim in this documentary that actually the statement that vegans need to supplement B12 is counteracted by saying that actually everybody needs to be supplementing with B12. But that's not strictly true. And actually, if we look at the NHS, what they say is that adults between 19 and 64 need about 1.5 micrograms per day of vitamin B12. Now, if you eat meat, fish, or dairy foods, you should be able to get enough vitamin B12 from your diet. But as vitamin B12 is not naturally found in foods such as fruits, vegetables, grains, vegans may not get enough of it. And the Department for Health and Social Care says that you should be able to get all of your vitamin B12 you need from eating a varied and balanced diet. If you take vitamin B12 supplements, do not take too many, as this may be harmful. So again, it just presents it glosses over one of the key areas that actually, if it was being transparent and honest, it would say, do you know what? We do need to be careful with these B vitamins and iron for women in particular. We need to be careful with these. I had to make sure I got it right in my diet. I managed to do it by doing these things, but it was something I had to be careful of, particularly because of my sporting performances. I didn't want it to drop off. But to just say, I thought it was going to be a problem, but it was amazing, that doesn't help anyone, and it's not transparent. And it's actually, this particularly was one of the things that agitated me the most about this documentary. And then finally, another classic example of this documentary is we had Bryant Jennings, who's a boxer, and he switched to a vegan diet. He's a great example because he talks about eating lots of fried chicken, which actually comes up a lot with a lot of the pro footballers, that they'd have fried chicken the night before the game. And again, that's not going to represent the best choice for sporting performance. And yes, compared that to a vegan-based approach, I'm not too surprised that a lot of them are feeling better if that's their pre-game food. Doesn't mean that one is, a balanced diet versus a vegan diet is going to be better, because both can be equally good for you when they're done properly. But if your choice is between fried chicken the night before and something more balanced, which happens to be vegan, I would go for the vegan in that situation. And Bryant Jennings is a great example of this. He stopped eating meat, and he says, I used to eat a lot of fried chicken. And he says that for him, he refers to the fact that asparagus and most other vegetables only came out 5 years ago when he switched to a plant-based diet. So for him, he said, particularly asparagus, he'd never had it before he'd switched to being plant-based. And if that's the case from him, asparagus and most vegetables only started being included within his diet 5 years previous when he took up being plant-based, and he was eating lots of fried chicken as the alternative, we can see that he's going to feel better on the plant-based diet. It doesn't necessarily mean that he could have not felt a lot better with a better balanced diet, including animal products. Again, it's looking at those two extremes, and again, I'm not surprised he feels better. Does that mean it's optimal? And does that mean that he needed to go to that extreme? Now, he may have felt better because he was just being really strict, and some people do thrive when they are being much stricter and much firmer in their approach. It doesn't necessarily mean that the plant-based diet is the superior one in this situation. So, I'm just going to wrap up one last part to the Game Changers section of this podcast. If you haven't seen it, go and watch it. Go and check out the Ben Coomber podcast, which I'll link down below for a bit more of a detailed breakdown on the nutritional side. As I said before, I've really just started... As I said before, I've really tried to focus on the critical thinking, scratching below the surface, and actually just looking at what's practical, because I don't think too much of what I've highlighted in this podcast is beyond most people if they're prepared to look at it and say, right, what information am I giving? Do I believe this? What feels right? What feels uncomfortable? And why is this being presented in this way? If you apply those skills, I think you'll come to the similar conclusion to what I have, and I think that is a smart approach without the need to necessarily feel like you have to have the deepest understanding of every nutritional component of these types of documentaries. If you apply the critical thinking skills to all of these documentaries, you will very quickly get a better understanding of where the message is mixed as you watch them. Finally, the final part of this documentary was more balanced as we turn to Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he says that if you tell people they can't cut out, or if you tell people they can't eat meat, he says that they're going to tell you to fuck off. Excuse my language, but they're going to tell you to get lost. And he says you haven't got the right to do that. He says, but if you encourage them to eat less, to reduce, improve the quality of what they're eating, and actually include meat-free days and be more balanced, then that's going to be better for everyone. And that's something that he does. And he's a man that's had a lot of heart problems. Thankfully, still with us. But the final part was more balanced. And if they had taken that message through the whole thing, actually, I think people who were perhaps a bit more moderate like me would have got on board with a lot more of the message that was coming out of the documentary. And I think they damaged what could have been a really, really good approach, because they could have jumped in on a lot more on the athletes about how they balanced out those diets. What was good before? What did they find hard? What would be a better middle ground? How have they enjoyed the switch? What are the challenges? How can people benefit from being meat-free on more than one day per week? Maybe including some components of animal products, but cutting out others. There's lots of things they could do, but they chose not to. So that is my summary of the Game Changers. Check it out if you haven't seen it. It is watchable for sure. And then just consider the critical thinking around some of these topics that we talked about today. Right, let's move on to the second part of the podcast. And as I mentioned at the start, we're going to round out today's podcast there, just covering the Game Changers documentary. I do hope you found this podcast useful. As I mentioned before, right back at the beginning, I will be back with another podcast in the future talking about that separate study looking at plant-based diets and their use in endurance sports. But for now, that ends and concludes our three-part series looking at plant-based diets. I do hope you found it useful. Please share it with someone that you feel would benefit from either one or all of the episodes within this series. And until then, look after yourselves. I hope you found this podcast useful. I am Andy Strong, signing off for the Fundamentally Fit podcast. Until next time, take care.